Plankton and Karen is the most consistent romantic relationship in the SpongeBob series. With many married couples in long-running shows, episodes revolving around their relationship will often devolve into tired tropes. And for the most part, Plankton and Karen avoid falling into this trap. But in Season 16's Karen's Klatch, that is most certainly not the case. Chapter 1. What makes a believable character flaw? Karen's Klatch begins with this shot, which, beyond its desperate attempt to become the next big meme image, establishes Plankton's central character flaw that is challenged throughout the episode, which is insecurity.
Are you ashamed of me?
Because Plankton doesn't view himself as the ideal husband, he believes that Karen and her computer friends are talking about him behind his back, which motivates him to spy on them, which leads to him facing negative consequences, teaching the lesson that not everything is about you and that you should respect people's boundaries. Already, just by virtue of having themes, a defined character flaw, and a lesson, this episode is far and away better than most modern SpongeBob episodes, which seem to think those things are optional. But there's a few issues in execution that leave a lot to be desired in this episode. The actual establishment of Plankton's insecurity is a little muddied because of how much Karen tries to make sure that he isn't even around when her friends show up. She locks him away in the lab and even bars the door, and also doesn't answer when he directly asks if she's ashamed of him. Now, I think the writers were going with this being a misunderstanding, that Karen acted a bit rashly and wasn't able to properly extinguish Plankton's insecurities due to her anticipation of her friend showing up. But the problem with the opening is that it doesn't do enough to show us that Plankton's insecurity issue is all in his own head, and thus an element of his own character flaw. It almost seemed like the show is telling us that Karen is ashamed of Plankton, rather than telling us that Plankton thinks Karen is ashamed of Plankton, and the fact that it comes off as the former and not the latter weakens Plankton's insecurity as his character flaw, because he has now been given a more acceptable reason to believe that Karen is ashamed of him. Whereas if the scene were rewritten to show that Plankton's belief that Karen is ashamed of him is all in his head, then Plankton would have no excuse for having this character flaw, and thus him being punished for it later would teach a better lesson. And the reason that I think the beginning of the episode is written this way is because the writers are giving into typical married couple sitcom tropes, rather than actually deeply considering what their story and characters need. Man is gross. Wife doesn't want him around her friends, so she pushes him away. Hijinks ensue. But not only is this a relatively weak trope all on its own, but it's also a trope where the wife would be the one in the wrong. Or more broadly and in a less gendered sense, the partner who is the one who is ashamed of the other partner would be in the wrong. And that partner should be the one who learns the lesson that they shouldn't be ashamed of their spouse. But this episode takes that trope and mixes it with the trope of insecure partner who thinks their significant other is ashamed of them, and then just arbitrarily decides to have Plankton be the one in the wrong who gets comeuppance because he's the less likable and the more punishable character in this couple. And this is where the main problem of this episode rears its ugly head. The writers not really grasping Plankton and Karen as a couple and how they can best be used to tell stories about committed romantic relationships. See, the Plankton-Karen relationship gives the SpongeBob writers the opportunity to tell stories involving a pretty dysfunctional romantic dynamic. I mean, there are literally 2 episodes off the top of my head where Plankton cheats on Karen, and the show is able to get away with this for 3 main reasons. 1, the romantic relationship is not central to the show itself, like say Homer and Marge Simpson, who, while they have relationship conflict, have to exist within certain limits in order to maintain the status quo of the series. 2, Plankton is a villain, so him being a bad husband at times is consistent with his character and doesn't affect how the audience views him, as he was already a bad guy to begin with. And 3, Karen is an AI. Oh wait, is she an AI? Well, you'll have to watch my other video where I examine that question, link in the description. But Karen's computer wife status adds a level of science fiction-y wackiness to the relationship that the writers can use to tell unique stories that all relate to real relationship issues. And when you take a couple like that with all that story potential and reduce them to these shallow sitcom tropes, And then you can't even get those simple tropes right. You just find yourself with a load of wasted potential. A better example of Plankton's insecurities sabotaging his relationship with Karen is in the season 6 episode Computer Overload. It's funny, usually when I do these types of videos, I'll compare the modern episode to a classic episode. But Plankton and Karen as a couple isn't really explored that much in the first 3 seasons of the show. In fact, only 2 episodes of classic SpongeBob even acknowledge that Karen is Plankton's wife at all, and neither of them center on their relationship. So Plankton and Karen's relationship actually started to get explored in middle SpongeBob, and even though middle SpongeBob can be mixed at times, I think Computer Overload is a high point of that era in the series. Probably because exploring Plankton and Karen's relationship at that time was a more fresh idea. So Computer Overload begins with an argument between Plankton and Karen over the quality of Plankton's chum. While arguing, Plankton gets a customer, which he feels is proving him right in the argument. But then he finds out that the customer just thinks he's at the Krusty Krab, so it wasn't an actual chum bucket customer. This third party showing up to prove Karen right in the debate of whether or not Plankton is a failure at his restaurant is able to quickly and effectively settle the opening debate and place Plankton and Karen into their respective roles of the episode, with Plankton being the one who thinks that Karen is the cause of his failures, and Karen believing that Plankton is the cause of his own failures, and the events of the story going on to prove Karen right and Plankton wrong, and challenging Plankton to either accept that Karen was right all along or lose his relationship. Now, compare this to Karen's Klatch, where it's not as easy to see who is right and who is wrong. Is Plankton right to be insecure? I don't know. There's no third party, like the customer in Computer Overload, to settle that. And you may be thinking, well, maybe this story is trying to be more nuanced, to have both Plankton and Karen be in the wrong at the same time. And you're correct that a story doesn't always have to have one character be 100% in the wrong and the other be in the right. But Karen's Klatch only frames Plankton as being in the wrong, as he's the only character who gets meaningfully punished. So, if the narrative wanted to have a more nuanced approach where both sides of the couple have their flaws, they needed to lean more into how Karen was wrong to push away her husband. But because they're falling into shallow tropes, they have the doofy man do all the bad stuff because that's generally how this sort of stuff goes. Chapter 2: Robots. So Karen's Klatch has these 3 friends of Karen who are all some other design of computer. And like, I get it, she is a computer, so she'd have friends who are computers, sure. But sometimes cartoons do this where they see character is X thing and they just kind of lean into expanding X thing without understanding why the original character being X thing was meaningful in the first place. Karen being a computer always generally has something to do with any story that she takes place in. Take, for example, Enemy-in-Law, where the fact that Karen is a computer is why Plankton feels he can just let her go and cheat on her with Mr. Krabs' mom. This dehumanization of Karen for being a computer, despite the fact that Plankton did make a marital commitment to her, is something that the story criticizes Plankton for by punishing him in the end of the episode. Or, in Computer Overload, Plankton questions Karen's abilities as his computer assistant in helping him steal the formula, blaming her for his failures in completing the task. Blaming a computer for yourself not being talented enough to do something seems like a timeless lesson. Plankton then builds a bunch of other robots that he believes can replace Karen, and with those robots failing, the common denominator of failure is revealed to be Plankton himself. What makes Computer Overload work so well as a story is how Karen being a computer and the presence of the other 3 rival robots makes this a unique story that could only be told using these specific characters. The robot friends in Karen's Klatch? Well, switch them out with human friends. Heck, maybe even switch out Karen herself with a human, and the story wouldn't really be meaningfully different, other than the fact that Plankton does take over the body of one of the robot friends in order to spy on them, which would have been pretty morbid if they weren't robots. But I just think, even with that one use case, the concept of Karen having a group of robot friends is really not used to its fullest potential. Beyond, look, there's some other computer characters, like Karen. It makes me aware that this episode is a cheap gimmick. And even though the 3 robots at Computer Overload are also gimmicks to make that episode stick out in our mind, because the Computer Overload robots earned their place in the episode and the Karen's Klatch robots didn't, I become aware of the gimmickiness of them. And just look at the respective designs of each robot group. The Computer Overload robots have so much personality to them with their appliance-based, roughly put together looks and bright colors. The robots in Computer Overload don't even have dialogue, yet they do so much to tell the story. And then the surprise at the end that the 3 robots actually all put themselves together to form one big robot turns what were silly designs into something that I can almost kind of believe would be threatening. And then we look at the Karen's Klatch robots. It's just Karen with a different sort of technology. iPhone with arms, other kind of computer with wire arms, really old-timey computer who doesn't actually talk and just prints out copy of what it's speaking. And while that last one is definitely the most clever, I can't help but point out that the whole reason that one of these computer friends doesn't have dialogue is because the writers both knew they needed to have at least 3 friends to make the episode work, but at the same time didn't really want to write dialogue for all 3 of them. So they had one just not talk to cop out of giving it a memorable personality. But, I mean, they also copped out on the other 2 having a meaningful personality. What do I have to say about Phone Arms Guy, other than the fact that he's there and he's a phone with arms? You know, he's a phone, right? Why not have him be like really gossipy, you know, because of social media and all that? But no, all we really get is, I coded 1,000,000 lines of binary code. Get it? Because he's a robot. I mean, I guess Plankton was being like robot racist or something.
Beep, boop, bleep. Bunch of babbling beepers.
But beyond that, them being computers really didn't do much for the story. Chapter 3: Messy Moments. So, after Plankton impersonates one of the robot friends, he realizes they aren't talking about him, and then he says,
"Why aren't they talking about me?"
Which sure, is kinda comedic, but a bit inconsistent with the character flaw he had, you know? Like, I kinda get it. When he finds out they weren't talking negatively about him, he's disappointed they weren't talking positively about him, which leans further into Plankton's arrogance. But this character flaw on Plankton's part isn't really expanded upon, other than the one funny line about it. Then, in another unfocused moment, SpongeBob shows up as the caterer with, like, computer parts or whatever. Just another basic, boring, loosely computer-based gag. And then Plankton has this sort of reaction when SpongeBob says, "Krusty Krab."
The Krusty Krab?
But then that just gets immediately dropped once he goes,
Computer food? Lame.
Like, it seemed like there was supposed to be a secret formula-related thing going on here, but it sorta died on the vine. And then, after some Plankton torture, Karen discovers that Plankton is inside the one computer friend. This happens, like, immediately after he took over the friend, so we don't even really see all that much of the dynamic of Plankton navigating the social group, with Karen not actually knowing it's him. Then more Plankton torture happens because Karen knows he's in the computer shell. It's just multiple minutes of long, drawn out, unfunny scenes of Plankton getting hurt. Remember how I said earlier that the episode could have leaned more into the story? Well, all of these overextended scenes are what we got instead. And all of this stuff, the Plankton saying, "Why aren't they talking about me?" The random computer food, the Plankton torture. Can't you see when looking at it in this context that the writers are just going through the motions? Just having things happen because they sound right in the moment, but not actually understanding how to connect it to the overall story? And the reason I think that happened is because I don't think they really care about an overall story. I said earlier that this episode is still above a lot of other modern SpongeBob episodes, just by virtue of it having some semblance of a story. But with all this in mind, I can tell that that semblance of a story just kinda happened by accident. An episode of the show that has kind of become the hallmark of no story modern SpongeBob episodes on this channel is Laundro Madness, which is also from season 16 that I discussed in my Modern SpongeBob Doesn't Understand Basic Storytelling video. And my main thesis of that video is that Laundro Madness fails as a narrative because all that happens in the episode is just events, like Squidward wanting to get get his shirt cleaned or an evil washing machine attacking everyone. It lacks themes, it lacks a lesson, it lacks a story. Karen's Klatch, in its final presentation, is meaningfully different from Laundromatis because of the presence of Plankton having his insecurity get challenged. Again, it's not presented well. I'd say it's the difference between a student actually turning in their homework but all the answers are wrong, as opposed to just not turning it in at all. Better, sure, but you're still getting an F. But in looking at both of these season 16 episodes, one of which has a story and the other doesn't, I want to ask the question, why is that? And I think the answer is that the writers aren't considering these vital story necessities at all, even in episodes that otherwise have them. They're just doing whatever it is that fills the 11 minutes with enough wacky stuff to complete the episode order. They're going through the motions, and if one of those motions happens to be Plankton having a character flaw gets challenged, then that happens. Cool. But it's clearly not a requirement for the writers, and I think that that is a major problem. And I am sure this was not the case with the writing staff in the early seasons, as every single episode in classic SpongeBob, and actually season 4 as well, has what I would consider to be an actual story. There's no way that's a coincidence. The writers had to be actively considering these sorts of things in order for that to be the case. The reason why they don't consider these things now, I could only guess. The most likely answer, I think, is that the writers just aren't given enough time to write the episodes, due to the executives being so sure that SpongeBob is gonna get consistent ratings that they don't give the writers enough hours to write better episodes, because better episodes obviously take more time. So in that environment, what more can you do but come up with a couple of quick gags and loosely tie it together? And every so often, a good story falls into place. And for the most part, SpongeBob gets to get away with it. But the funny thing is that the only reason that SpongeBob gets to get away with being such a shallow hit-or-miss show today is because in its earliest seasons, it was almost always a hit because it followed the very rules that it's shirking today. I don't really know why it has to be this way. Just have a set of rules for each episode to follow regarding characters needing to have defined character flaws that they overcome throughout the episode, and maybe give the hard-working writers a couple more work days to follow those rules, and you'd never see another modern SpongeBob Doesn't Understand X video from me ever again. Chapter 4. A weak ending. So then, Plankton gets exposed publicly when Karen breaks the screen and he admits why he spied on them. And then Karen playfully calls him paranoid, which, as we examined earlier, Karen did intentionally try to keep him away from her friends, so I don't really know why there's suddenly this line where she calls him paranoid. They probably weren't even thinking of the beginning lines when they wrote the ending lines. Oh yeah, and then it ends with the computer guy Plankton stole the body of flushing him down the toilet. Cool. Compare this messy ending of Karen's Klatch with the much cleaner ending of Computer Overload. In that episode, Karen leaves Plankton with the heartfelt goodbye letter that contains a moderate amount of references to the fact that Karen is a computer, but is more so focused on her actual feelings.
Dear Plankton, I've logged on to another network. Anyway, you're a grown single-celled organism and allowed to make your own syntax errors.
Compared to the whole of Karen's Klatch, where every line is just like, get it? They're computers.
Lucy trash talk. You mean a malware glitch?
Karen leaving Plankton raises the stakes, and her absence is felt throughout the entire finale of the episode where Plankton attacks the Krusty Krab. This final sequence does a great job of still capturing a feeling of action, while at the same time reminding us how pathetic and unthreatening Plankton is. This is best shown through his interaction with SpongeBob, where SpongeBob stops being nervous the second he sees Plankton, and the whole bit with SpongeBob writing down the demands.
What was that other thing?
Forget it!
And Plankton's final failure is so simple yet so elegant, with the plug connected to the robot just popping out and making the whole thing come crashing down. This is an example of a trope done well enough that you forget that it's a trope. It's the typical villain gets defeated by obvious design flaw they overlook, a staple of Wile E. Coyote. But what makes this trope done well in this episode is that it is directly tied to the story that is being told. Plankton's whole arc in this episode is about learning that he is wrong to blame someone else for his own failures. So what better better trope to have him fail than the trope that communicates your failures are your own fault. And then, after this failure, Karen returns and Plankton apologizes, completing his arc and bringing the two back together. So, when we see where computer overload succeeds and where Karen's Klatch fails, I'd say the main culprit is going through the motions writing, which is probably caused by a rushed writing staff. Computer overload is in season 6, which is well past when stories became optional in SpongeBob. But it was close enough to those early days of the show that I think there was enough of that writing rhythm to still produce solid episodes like this one, even if it wasn't as thought about during this time. But now, all these years later in modern SpongeBob, it seems the show itself has forgotten really what a story is, in the pursuit of still trying to keep the series going. Sometimes we get good episodes, sure, but it feels like they happen by accident. But a good episode doesn't have to be an accident. There are things that writers can and should do to make episodes resonate with the audience. And when those things aren't done, well, maybe they should go back to the writer's room and see where it all went wrong. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, maybe you'd like my 2-hour analysis on every Kamp Koral episode. Or if you'd like to hear my unscripted live stream content where I tear apart AI content farm channels, you should click this other video right here. If you like what I do and want to show even more support, consider becoming a channel member or supporting my Patreon. See you next time.